At 11:32 a.m. on November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was crouched in the tail compartment of a B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Rikki Tikki Tavi, watching German fighters converge on his bomber like a swarm of hornets. He was 19 years old, a dairy farmer's son from rural Wisconsin, and this was his first combat mission over one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Germany. That morning, more than 300 bombers from the 8th Air Force had been dispatched to strike the factories of Bremen. Within the first hour, German defenses had already destroyed 6 flying fortresses. Moran occupied the most isolated station on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat at the extreme rear of the bomber, perched on a narrow bicycle-style seat, separated from the rest of the crew by nearly 40 feet of fuselage. Between him and the cockpit were bulkheads, fuel tanks, bomb bays, and chaos. His only companions were twin .50 caliber machine guns, and the enemy fighters intent on killing him. A B-17 carried 10 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer in the top turret, radio operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners firing from open side windows, a ball turret gunner suspended beneath the aircraft in a fragile glass sphere, and Moran alone in the tail. His job was simple in theory: defend the bomber's weakest angle. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking from directly behind a B-17 limited the defensive fire to a single man. Eliminate the tail gunner, and the bomber became exponentially more vulnerable. By late 1943, bomber losses over Germany were staggering. 2 months earlier, the Schweinfurt mission had cost the 8th Air Force 60 flying fortresses in a single day. 600 men killed or captured within hours. Crews began referring to deep penetration missions into Germany as milk runs to hell. The mathematics were unforgiving. A bomber crew needed to complete 25 missions to rotate home. Statistical survival estimates suggested the average crew lasted 15. Some groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Moran had enlisted on his 18th birthday. Growing up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he had watched aircraft pass overhead and dreamed of being part of something larger. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with steady hands and sharp reflexes, farm boys accustomed to rifles. In gunnery school, Moran learned to lead moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He was drilled to fire in short bursts to prevent barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of enemy fighters: Messerschmitt Bf 109, Focke-Wulf 190. At 2,000 yards, he could identify them. But nothing in training prepared him for combat at 24,000 feet. Temperatures plunged to 40, below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Oxygen masks iced over. Movements became slow and exhausting in the thin air. German fighters attacked in disciplined waves, firing 20-millimeter cannon shells capable of ripping through aluminum skin as though it were paper. Rikki Tikki Tavi had taken off from Snetterton Heath in England as part of the 96th Bomb Group. Their objective? Bremen, shipyards, aircraft plants, submarine facilities, one of the most fortified cities in Germany. The bomber formation crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each B-17 positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The concept was straightforward. Mass defensive firepower would repel enemy fighters. The reality was harsher. A direct hit on one aircraft often damaged others flying nearby. When Bremen's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, black bursts of flak filled the sky. The bombers could not evade. They were required to fly straight and level during the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a B-17 ahead of them absorb a direct hit. The aircraft folded mid-air and fell away. Rikki Tikki Tavi released its 4,000 pounds of bombs over the target. The factories below disappeared beneath explosions. Mission accomplished. Now came the return flight, 200 miles of hostile airspace between them and England. That was when flak struck their No. 2 engine. The propellers spun uselessly, windmilling in the freezing air. Speed dropped. A damaged bomber falling behind formation was marked for death. German pilots hunted stragglers. A lone fortress without the collective firepower of the formation was easy prey. Moran saw them first. Fighters climbing from below. Others diving from above. A dozen shapes closing in. Rikki Tikki Tavi was about to fight alone. And in the tail compartment, Eugene Moran would be their first target. The first attackers approached from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and slightly beneath the bomber. That angle was deliberate. German pilots knew it forced the B-17 to rely almost entirely on the tail gunner's fire. Moran pressed his back against the armored steel plate behind his seat and squeezed both triggers. His twin .50 caliber machine guns erupted, sending streams of tracer rounds into the freezing sky. The vibration shook the narrow compartment. The first German fighter broke away, rolling hard to escape the incoming fire. But there were more. The Luftwaffe pilots attacked in coordinated pairs. One aircraft would draw defensive fire while the second lined up a more precise killing pass. Moran swung his guns left and right, tracking shapes that flashed past his limited field of view. Spent shell casings piled around his boots. Cordite fumes filled the confined space. Inside the bomber, the temperature was minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold penetrated everything. His breath froze into crystals inside his oxygen mask. His fingers, though gloved, began to lose sensation as the guns overheated from sustained firing. The German pilots were veterans. Many had been fighting since 1939. They understood exactly how to dismantle a B-17. First, disable engines. A crippled bomber could not maintain formation. Second, eliminate defensive gunners. Remove the guns, and the aircraft became a target. Finally, saturate the fuselage with cannon fire until something critical failed. Moran heard the impact of 20-millimeter shells before he felt the vibration. Aluminum panels buckled, metal tore. The intercom crackled with fragments of panicked voices and static. Somewhere forward, one of the waist gunners stopped firing, then the other. The aircraft shuddered as more rounds struck home. Moran continued firing. There was no alternative. A Focke-Wulf swept in from the 4 o'clock position. Moran pivoted, led the target, and fired a tight burst. The fighter's wing disintegrated under the impact. It spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His first confirmed kill. There was no time to acknowledge it. Moments later, cannon rounds smashed into the tail section. Moran felt a violent blow against his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves almost immediately. Pain flared white-hot, but his hands still responded. He could still grip the triggers. Another series of impacts ripped through the vertical stabilizer above him. Control cables snapped and whipped violently. The entire tail assembly vibrated with a new intensity. Something was catastrophically wrong. Instinctively, Moran glanced down at his parachute. The silk canopy was packed tightly in the canvas harness strapped to his chest. His only hope if the bomber went down. He saw holes, multiple jagged tears through the fabric. Cannon shells had shredded it. If he had to bail out, the chute would not open. He would fall 4 miles to his death. The fighters continued attacking in relentless waves. Moran counted at least 15 circling the crippled bomber. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was losing altitude. The remaining engines strained. Oil pressure gauges in the cockpit were likely fluctuating wildly. Somewhere forward, men were dying. Navigator Jesse Orison was still alive in the nose section, wounded but conscious. The pilot and co-pilot had already been killed at the controls. The flight engineer in the top turret was dead. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had departed England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orison in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage separated them. Then another cannon shell struck something vital. The aircraft lurched violently. A grinding vibration traveled through the frame. The shaking intensified until Moran's teeth rattled. Then came a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. The shriek of tearing aluminum. The scream of structural failure. The fuselage fractured just ahead of the tail section. Moran watched, helpless, as the front half of the aircraft, wings, engines, cockpit, and the bodies of his crewmates separated and fell away toward the German countryside far below. He was suddenly alone in a severed tail assembly, wounded in both arms, parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory. Falling. Physics offered no mercy. A human body in freefall reaches terminal velocity around 120 miles per hour. The detached tail section, weighing thousands of pounds, would fall even faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. The tail spun violently as it dropped, tumbling end over end. The centrifugal force slammed him against the interior walls of the compartment. His broken arms screamed in agony. Blood splattered the metal framework. Wind howled through the open fracture where the rest of the aircraft had been moments earlier. He should have been paralyzed by fear. He should have curled into himself and waited. Instead, he did something that defied reason. He reached for his guns. The tail section spun violently as it plunged toward the earth. The world became a blur of gray sky and distant ground. The G-forces threw Moran against the steel frame, then lifted him partially from his seat as the section rotated again. His arms were shattered. Blood covered his sleeves. His parachute was useless. He was falling from 24,000 feet. And he kept firing. German fighters circled the wreckage, initially cautious, perhaps expecting debris, not resistance. They moved closer to confirm the kill. Moran gripped the triggers again. Aiming was nearly impossible. The tail compartment rotated unpredictably. One moment the sky filled his vision, the next the ground. He fired when the nose of a Messerschmitt drifted across his field of view. Tracer rounds streaked wildly through open air. The German pilots scattered. They had never encountered this. A man trapped in a severed aircraft tail, wounded and falling, still fighting. One fighter caught several rounds across its fuselage. It banked sharply and dove away trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section had shattered, but Moran could see the earth rising rapidly. Farmland below, fields divided by hedgerows, clusters of forest, thin roads cutting across winter-gray terrain. Something unexpected happened. The tail section's shape began to slow its descent. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers, designed to guide the bomber in level flight, now caught air, like crude wings. Drag increased. The violent spinning reduced slightly. Instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage began to glide erratically. Not controlled flight, but not pure freefall either. Moran estimated later that he was descending at roughly 100 feet per second. Fast enough to kill him on impact, but slower than terminal velocity. The stabilizers were buying him seconds. Seconds he used to keep firing at any aircraft foolish enough to approach. The ground closed in. 5,000 feet. 3,000. 1,000. He braced himself against the armored chest plate. There was nothing else to do. The tail struck the top of a pine tree at close to 100 miles per hour. Branches snapped like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding twisted aluminum with every impact. Moran's head slammed against the steel framework above him. White light exploded across his vision. He felt ribs fracture. His already damaged arms bent unnaturally. Another tree. Another impact. Then the tail section crashed into frozen ground. Silence. Eugene Moran was alive? Barely. He lay in the shattered metal, unable to move properly. Both forearms were broken in multiple places, compound fractures. Bone protruded through torn skin. His ribs were crushed. A head wound had torn part of his scalp away. Blood froze in the winter air. The crash site lay in a forest near a small German town south of Bremen, deep in enemy territory. Moments earlier, American bombs had fallen on the factories nearby. Civilians had likely died. Now an American airman lay broken among their trees. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were nearly useless. Hypothermia would claim him within hours, if blood loss did not. He dragged himself toward the opening where the tail had separated from the fuselage. Each movement sent waves of pain through his body. He pulled himself onto frozen soil and stared up at the gray sky. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a functioning parachute. Only 3 Allied airmen would accomplish that during the entire war. But survival meant nothing if he bled out alone in a forest. Voices approached. German voices. Soldiers investigating the crash. They emerged cautiously, rifles raised, scanning for threats. Instead, they found a teenage American airman barely conscious in the snow. One soldier shouted orders. Another ran toward the road, likely to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they manipulated his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank, his ruined parachute. They left him lying on frozen ground while they examined the wreckage. Within an hour, an officer arrived. He assessed Moran's injuries and shook his head. The American appeared to be dying, but orders required capture and interrogation if possible. Dead airmen provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blanket, no treatment. The cart bounced along frozen roads for what felt like hours. Each jolt sent new pain through broken ribs and fractured arms. Blood on his scalp had frozen into a dark crust. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Eventually, he was delivered to a German military facility. He remembered concrete beneath him. German voices discussing him as though he were already a corpse. No doctor came, no morphine, no bandages. German medical resources were limited. Wounded enemy airmen ranked low on priority lists. For 2 days, he lay untreated. Infection began to spread. His broken arms darkened. The exposed skull tissue swelled. Without surgery, he would lose his limbs. Without antibiotics, sepsis would claim him. The guards watched him deteriorate, some indifferent, some almost sympathetic, none empowered to act. On the 3rd day, he was loaded onto another cart, another journey. This time to a prisoner of war hospital, a makeshift facility where wounded Allied airmen were treated just enough to survive transfer to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed. Supplies were scarce. German doctors triaged ruthlessly. Those deemed salvageable received attention. Those considered beyond saving were left to die. Moran's condition placed him firmly in the latter category. But the hospital held an unexpected lifeline. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian physicians, captured military doctors pressed into service treating Allied POWs. They examined Moran, and they chose to try. The 2 Serbian doctors had almost nothing to work with. They were prisoners themselves, former military physicians captured on the Eastern Front, and now forced to treat wounded Allied airmen in a German POW hospital. Supplies were scarce. Surgical instruments were old and incomplete. Anesthesia was minimal. But they saw in Moran not just an enemy combatant. They saw a wounded young man who still had a pulse. They decided to operate. The procedure lasted 7 hours. There was no proper general anesthesia, only limited local numbing agents that dulled the pain but did not erase it. Moran drifted in and out of awareness as they worked. They set his shattered forearms using metal pins and wire scavenged from what little was available. They cleaned infected tissue from open wounds. They removed bone fragments from his skull and fashioned a crude metal plate to protect the exposed area of his brain. The plate was primitive by modern standards. It saved his life. They splinted his arms with wooden boards. They wrapped his injuries in bandages torn from sheets. They did everything possible with almost nothing. When the surgery ended, they told him plainly, the next 72 hours would determine whether he lived. The infection was already in his bloodstream. They had cleaned what they could. Now his body had to do the rest. That first night, the fever surged. His temperature climbed past 104 degrees. He shook violently under thin hospital blankets. Sweat soaked his clothes even as the winter air bit at his skin. The Serbian doctors monitored him as closely as resources allowed. They forced water between his cracked lips. They changed dressings. They sat beside him because they had little else to offer. Antibiotics existed, penicillin was beginning to change battlefield medicine, but in a German POW hospital, such supplies were nearly unattainable. Infection was the great killer. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmates who were no longer alive. He relived the moment his bomber tore apart in midair. Other wounded prisoners listened in silence, wondering whether he would see morning. The doctors took turns sitting at his bedside. They wiped his forehead with damp cloths. They spoke softly, in accented English, that he likely could not understand. They could do nothing more. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized the room for the first time in days. He was alive. His immune system had done what medicine could not. The tissue around his skull plate began to close. His arms showed early signs of knitting. The infection receded. Recovery would take months, but he would survive. Word spread quickly among prisoners and guards alike. The American who fell 4 miles and lived. The tail gunner who kept firing as his aircraft disintegrated. Even German staff seemed quietly astonished. The Serbian doctors had saved him, but they could not shield him forever. Once stable enough to travel, he would be transferred into the formal German prisoner of war system. The hospital was merely a way station. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could stand. His arms remained splinted. The metal plate in his skull caused persistent headaches. His ribs protested every breath. But he could walk. He was processed efficiently. Name, rank, serial number. Photographs were taken. A gaunt young man with bandaged arms and hollow eyes staring into a camera. He was sent to Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a camp built specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, guard towers equipped with machine guns. Wooden barracks offering little protection from the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the compound. Pilots, navigators, gunners. Men shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Some had been prisoners for years. All were waiting. Life inside the camp developed its own structure. Prisoners organized themselves. They maintained military discipline. They created makeshift libraries. They taught classes in languages and mathematics. They built hidden radios to monitor BBC broadcasts. They planned escape attempts that rarely succeeded. Rations were minimal. Thin soup, black bread, occasional potatoes. Red Cross parcels supplemented their diet when deliveries arrived, but those were unpredictable. Most prisoners lost 20 to 30 pounds during captivity. Some lost far more. Moran's body continued to heal slowly. His arms regained partial function, though strength never fully returned. Headaches from his skull injury became less frequent, but never disappeared. The nightmares did not stop. He was alive. But 17 months of captivity still lay ahead, and conditions would soon worsen. In the summer of 1944, he was transferred again. The journey began in a cattle car packed with 60 prisoners. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against each other in the dark. From one camp to another, he was shuffled across occupied territory, as Germany's defensive lines contracted under Allied pressure. Each relocation brought new guards, new hardships, new disease. Then came the Baltic transfer. The ship that carried them was an aging freighter, never intended to transport hundreds of men below deck. 200 prisoners were forced into the cargo hold. Darkness swallowed them as the hatch sealed shut. There was no ventilation. No room to lie down. Only a single bucket for sanitation. Within hours, the stench became overwhelming. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men suffering from dysentery could not reach the bucket. Bodies of those who died remained among the living because there was nowhere else to place them. Some prisoners lost their sanity in the darkness. They screamed. They prayed. They stopped responding altogether. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed into gray daylight with eyes that struggled to focus. His clothes were soaked. His body was weaker than ever. The metal plate in his skull throbbed constantly. The ship delivered survivors to another camp in East Prussia. More wire, more towers, more waiting. But by early 1945, the war was shifting. Soviet forces advanced from the east. Allied armies pressed from the west. German guards grew visibly nervous. Something was changing. On February 6, 1945, it happened. Orders came for immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west, on foot, in winter. Refusal meant death. Moran had survived falling from the sky. Now he faced 600 miles of frozen roads. The evacuation began before dawn. Thousands of Allied airmen assembled in the frozen compound, forming a column that stretched for miles. Temperatures hovered near 20 below zero. Many prisoners lacked proper winter coats. Some had no gloves. Boots were worn thin from months of captivity. They had survived on starvation rations. Now they were expected to walk across a collapsing Germany. German guards marched alongside them with rifles ready. The instructions were blunt. Keep moving. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who attempted escape would be shot. The column trudged westward through snow and ice, 15 to 20 miles each day. They slept in abandoned barns, in sheds thick with animal waste, sometimes in open fields beneath frozen skies. They drank melted snow or water from ditches contaminated by runoff and human waste. They scavenged raw potatoes from fields when possible. Moran's body protested every step. His arms, never fully healed, throbbed in the cold. The metal plate in his skull seemed to conduct freezing air directly into his brain. His ribs ached constantly. Every breath burned. Men collapsed daily. Some simply sank into the snow and did not rise again. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours. Guards fired shots when stragglers slowed the pace. The march left a trail of bodies behind it, silent markers across the countryside. Later, it would be known as the Black March. 86 days of forced movement through blizzards, freezing rain, and starvation. An estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died during that ordeal. Pneumonia, typhus, dysentery, frostbite that turned to gangrene, bullets. Moran kept walking. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. He had survived catastrophic injuries. He had survived crude surgery and raging infection. He had survived the darkness of the Baltic hold. He refused to die on a frozen road. By March 1945, the column had covered nearly 500 miles. Allied artillery could be heard in the distance, a low, constant thunder growing louder each day. Germany was collapsing. On April 26, 1945, the march ended. American troops from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards surrendered. For the prisoners, the moment felt unreal. Years of captivity and months of marching ended in stunned silence. They were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds. He had entered the army at 150. The crash, the camps, the starvation, and the march had stripped nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked skeletal, but he was alive. Medical teams moved quickly to treat liberated prisoners. Typhus had spread among the column. Pneumonia was widespread. Frostbite required amputations. Severe malnutrition complicated recovery. Moran's case drew attention. His service record documented an extraordinary sequence. Shot down over Bremen. Aircraft destroyed. Fell 24,000 feet in a severed tail section without a working parachute. Survived impact, captured. 17 months as a prisoner of war. Endured a 600-mile forced march. Military historians later confirmed that only 3 Allied airmen survived falls of comparable distance during the Second World War. Moran was one of them. He was awarded 2 Purple Hearts, one for each arm shattered by enemy cannon fire. He received the Air Medal with oak leaf cluster. He was granted an honorable discharge in December 1945. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war. 206 aircraft destroyed. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in a campaign defined by catastrophic losses. During the war, rumors of his fall circulated through intercepted German radio broadcasts. His family in Wisconsin spent months uncertain whether he was alive. Anonymous letters reached them describing reports of an American who fell 4 miles and survived. Hope mingled with fear until official confirmation arrived. He returned to Soldiers Grove in late 1945. He was 21 years old. He felt decades older. The farm boy who once watched planes pass overhead had fallen from the sky and lived. Now he faced a different challenge, building a life beyond survival. He married Margaret Finley, a local woman who had known him before the war. She saw beyond scars and hollow eyes. She saw the man beneath trauma. They built a life on a small farm near his childhood home. He rarely spoke of what happened in November 1943. Not to his wife, not to his 9 children, not to neighbors who asked. The memories were too sharp. 8 of his crew had died aboard Rikki Tikki Tavi. Friends had perished in camps and along the march. Silence was easier. For more than 60 years, he carried the story alone. The physical damage never fully disappeared. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. Cold weather aggravated his arms. Storms made his ribs ache. His body never forgot. But he lived. He raised children. He worked the land. He attended church. He watched grandchildren grow. He outlived most of the men who had shared his captivity. The boy who should have died a dozen times reached old age. In 2007, Wisconsin created a Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. Eugene Moran was its first recipient. Recognition came late. Journalists interviewed him. Historians recorded his account. A teacher named John Armbruster began documenting every detail: military records, German archives, interviews with witnesses. The long silence began to break. A book would eventually tell the full story. But long before that, in a frozen forest outside Bremen, survival had already rewritten the odds. As attention slowly gathered around Moran's story decades later, historians began reconstructing the chain of events with precision. Military archives confirmed the flak strike that severed the B-17. German records noted wreckage falling near Bremen. Survivor testimony from navigator Jesse Orison supported the account of the bomber breaking apart midair. What had once sounded like myth became documented fact. The physics of his survival fascinated researchers. When the fuselage split, the detached tail section retained aerodynamic surfaces, vertical and horizontal stabilizers designed to guide flight. Those surfaces created drag during descent, reducing terminal velocity just enough to make impact survivable under extraordinary circumstances. It was not luck alone. It was wreckage behaving like a crude glider. Even so, the probability bordered on impossible. Moran had not only survived the fall, he had continued firing while descending. German pilots later reported being startled by gunfire from debris they assumed was lifeless. That defiance more than the fall itself, cemented his legend among fellow airmen. Yet after returning home, he did not embrace legend status. He avoided public speaking. He declined opportunities to recount the experience in detail. When neighbors asked about the war, he changed the subject. Trauma leaves marks deeper than visible scars. Nightmares followed him for years. The sound of tearing aluminum replayed in his mind. Sudden noises caused him to flinch instinctively. Winter air sometimes triggered the same physical sensations he had felt at altitude. Margaret understood without pressing. She learned which subjects to avoid and which memories to gently redirect. Together they built a rhythm of normal life: chores, harvest seasons, church gatherings, school events for their children. The war became something that had happened, but was rarely spoken aloud. The children knew fragments. They knew their father had been shot down. They knew he had been a prisoner. They did not know the details until much later. Time passed. The Cold War began. The world shifted again. Aircraft technology advanced beyond piston engines to jets, then beyond that to supersonic fighters and guided missiles. The B-17 became an artifact of another era. But in Wisconsin, Eugene Moran continued farming. He measured success not in medals, but in crops harvested and family milestones reached. He attended veterans' reunions occasionally, reconnecting with men who shared similar experiences, though few had endured his specific ordeal. As decades passed, fewer veterans remained. Stories risked fading. It was only in his later years that Moran agreed to speak more openly. Encouraged by family and historians, he revisited the events of November 29, 1943. Interviews were recorded. Details once held privately were finally shared. The Serbian doctor's role gained recognition. Their quiet courage in operating under impossible conditions had saved a life history might otherwise have lost. Efforts were made to trace their identities, though wartime records were incomplete. Recognition also came locally. In October 2008, Soldiers Grove named a street in his honor, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the town where he had once watched aircraft overhead as a boy. The ceremony drew neighbors, veterans, and local officials. For many, the idea that a young farm boy from their community had survived such an ordeal seemed almost unreal. Yet there he stood, older now, thinner than photographs suggested, but steady. The other surviving crew member, navigator Jesse Orison, also confirmed the account. He had bailed out from the forward section before the aircraft broke apart completely and endured captivity of his own. His testimony strengthened the historical record. Together, their recollections ensured that Rikki Tikki Tavi would not be forgotten. Moran's health declined gradually in his later years, as it does for most who reach advanced age. The metal plate remained in his skull for the rest of his life. Doctors decades later marveled at the crude wartime surgery that had kept him alive. He rarely complained. When asked how he had endured so much, he offered a simple philosophy. He preferred to wear out rather than rust out. It was not bravado. It was stubborn endurance. The same determination that had kept him firing in a falling tail section carried him through infection, captivity, and forced marches. On March 23, 2014, Eugene Moran passed away at the age of 89. 70 years had passed since the day his bomber split apart over Bremen. 70 years since he fell 4 miles through freezing air. 70 years since Serbian doctors worked through the night to rebuild shattered bones. His obituary mentioned his service and survival, though even then it understated the improbability. Those who knew the full story understood. The tail gunner's position on a B-17 was the loneliest station on the aircraft. It was the first target in a rear attack. It was the last place to know when the bomber was doomed. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran occupied that seat. When the aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not surrender to panic. He kept fighting, even while falling. And in doing so, he defied not only the enemy, but the odds written into mathematics and gravity itself. For decades, the story remained largely confined to military archives and scattered veteran accounts. The Battle of Bremen, the shattered B-17, the fall from 24,000 feet, all of it existed in official records, but rarely in public memory. Moran did not seek recognition. He never framed himself as extraordinary. To him, survival was not heroism, it was persistence. But as historians revisited the air war over Europe, the context of his experience became clearer. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was engaged in a brutal campaign of daylight strategic bombing. Crews flew without long-range fighter escort deep into German airspace. Loss rates were so severe that mission planners debated whether operations could continue at all. The sky over Germany was not merely contested, it was lethal. German anti-aircraft batteries created dense barrages of flak. Luftwaffe fighter groups coordinated timed intercepts. Attacks came from multiple angles, head-on passes to exploit thin frontal armor, and rear assaults targeting tail gunners. Every mission was a calculation of probability. Every crew knew the odds. When Rikki-Tikki-Tavi lost its engine and began falling behind formation, the outcome seemed predictable. Stragglers rarely survived. German pilots waited for isolated bombers. Without overlapping fields of defensive fire from neighboring aircraft, a lone fortress was exposed. The fact that any part of the aircraft survived long enough for a tail section to descend semi-stably was itself remarkable. The fact that Moran remained conscious and firing added another layer of improbability. And yet, survival in war is often a combination of physics, training, and refusal to surrender. He had been trained to keep firing. He did. He had been trained to identify targets under pressure. He did. Even as his world collapsed around him. The forced march in 1945 revealed a different dimension of endurance. Survival in captivity is less visible than combat survival. There are no explosions, no dramatic moments. There is only hunger, cold, exhaustion, and time. Time can erode will as surely as bullets tear metal. But Moran continued placing one foot in front of the other, day after day, hundreds of miles, past men who fell and never rose again. When American forces intercepted the column in April 1945, many prisoners were too weak to cheer. Liberation felt unreal. After so long defined by captivity, freedom required adjustment. Repatriation involved medical treatment, debriefings, and a slow reintegration into civilian life. Some former prisoners struggled profoundly. Malnutrition left lasting damage. Psychological trauma lingered. Moran rarely spoke of those months, but his actions afterward reflected someone who had decided not to let the experience define him entirely. He built routine. Routine can be a form of recovery. Farming required focus. Planting, harvesting, repairing fences, tasks measured in tangible progress rather than survival odds. Raising children required patience and presence. Silence for him was not denial, it was containment. Only in later years did he agree to participate in recorded interviews. When he described the fall, he did so without embellishment. He spoke of sounds, tearing metal, rushing wind. He spoke of the Serbian doctors with gratitude. He spoke of the march with quiet understatement. He did not dramatize. Those who listened understood that restraint carried its own weight. The broader war narrative often highlights grand strategy, generals, campaigns, treaties. Individual stories like Moran's illustrate the human scale within that vast machinery. A 19-year-old farm boy in a tail compartment, 40 feet separated from his crew. First target in a rear attack. Last to know, the aircraft was breaking apart. There is something symbolic in that position. Alone at the rear, defending others, then falling alone, then surviving alone, long enough for others to intervene. The Serbian doctor's decision to operate remains one of the most compelling elements of the story. They were prisoners too. They had limited tools. They could have declared his case hopeless. Instead, they acted. War often reveals cruelty. It can also reveal quiet acts of compassion. Their work extended Moran's life long enough for survival to become possible. In later years, when asked how he endured so much, Moran returned to simple phrasing. He did not claim bravery. He claimed determination. That difference matters. Bravery suggests absence of fear. Determination suggests action despite it. The tail gunner seat on a B-17 demanded both. And on November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran embodied them. Not in a grand speech, not in a medal ceremony, but in a falling tail section, guns firing, refusing to yield. The story endures not because it is sensational, but because it reveals what resilience can look like under impossible conditions, and because, against overwhelming probability, he lived long enough to tell it. In the decades after the war, the skies over Europe grew quiet again. Bombers no longer formed defensive boxes above German cities. Flak batteries rusted. Airfields that once launched waves of destruction returned to civilian use. But history does not vanish simply because the noise stops. The events of November 29, 1943 remained recorded in mission logs, casualty reports, and prisoner of war files. In those documents, the language was clinical. Aircraft destroyed, crew missing, tail section separated. Survivor recovered. What the paperwork could not convey was the human experience inside those lines of text. The isolation of the tail gunner's position. The sensation of the aircraft trembling under cannon fire. The sound of structural failure. The decision to keep firing when everything else was lost. Moran's survival became a point of fascination, not because it was dramatic, but because it challenged assumptions. Gravity is constant. Structural failure is usually final. A 4-mile fall without a functioning parachute should not end in survival. Yet in rare cases, physics bends just enough to allow improbability. The tail section, acting like an ungainly glider. The pine trees breaking impact force. The Serbian doctors choosing to operate. The immune system overcoming infection. Each element alone would not have been sufficient. Together they created a narrow path through what should have been certain death. War is often reduced to statistics. Aircraft lost, sorties flown, targets destroyed. But each number represents individuals who experienced events in real time, seconds stretched into lifetimes. For the 8th Air Force, 1943 was one of the most punishing years of the European air campaign. Hundreds of bombers were destroyed. Thousands of young airmen were killed, captured, or wounded. Within that context, Moran's story does not diminish the broader losses. It highlights the extremes within them. He was not the only airman to endure captivity. He was not the only one to survive a crash. But the combination of fall, injury, imprisonment, forced march, and eventual return places his experience among the rarest. After liberation, after discharge, after decades of farming and family life, his survival took on another meaning. It became legacy. When Wisconsin honored him late in life, it was not simply for surviving a fall. It was for enduring everything that followed. The fall lasted seconds. Recovery lasted months. Captivity lasted 17 months. The march lasted 86 days. The memory lasted a lifetime. There is a temptation to describe such survival as miraculous. Moran himself would likely have disagreed. He did not attribute his life to miracles. He attributed it to not giving up. When his bomber broke apart, he did not stop firing. When infection threatened, he endured. When guards ordered him to march, he walked. When nightmares followed him home, he built a life anyway. His quiet philosophy, "I would rather wear out than rust out," captured that mindset. To wear out suggests movement, action, persistence. To rust out suggests surrender to stillness. He chose the first. The tail gunner's seat on a B-17 remains a symbol of isolation and vulnerability. It was the most exposed position during a rear attack. It required trust that the men forward would maintain course and that the gunner would hold his ground. On that November morning, the man in that seat did exactly that. When the aircraft disintegrated, he did not collapse into fear. He remained engaged, even as he fell. In the end, Eugene Moran's story is not merely about survival from extraordinary height. It is about resilience measured in decisions, to keep firing, to endure surgery, to walk another mile, to return home, and live quietly. The world moved on. Aircraft technology advanced. Wars changed. But somewhere in Wisconsin, a farmer once looked up at planes crossing the sky and remembered what it meant to fall through it and to survive. That is where this story ends. Not in the air over Bremen, not in a prisoner camp, not on a frozen road, but in the simple fact that he lived long enough to see peace. And that survival, against every probability, remains the most powerful part of all.